You're a virgin and I need sons." That's what the giant mountain man declared to the schoolteacher, right there in front of the whole town. Folks froze. Dust settled. No one spoke. It sounded like marriage, but it wasn't just that. Not for him, not for her. Behind that blunt proposal was a storm no one saw coming. A quiet war over land, water, and the kind of family you build when the world turns its back. The townsfolk laughed. The railroad men didn't. And when the schoolteacher picked up her Bible, everything changed. When pride and mercy collide on the frontier, which side do you take? And what happens when the outcasts are the only ones left to save the town? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The afternoon sun blazed through the schoolhouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Miss Clara Weston moved between the rows of rough-hewn desks, gathering forgotten pencils and straightening dog-eared readers. The mixed group of settler and Apache children had just filtered out into the dusty street, their excited chatter fading into the distance. She paused to wipe her brow with a delicate handkerchief. The heat made the air thick and heavy, even as the town council members filed in for their meeting. Their boots scraped against the floorboards as they settled into the children's small desks, looking comically oversized in seats meant for youngsters. The creak of the door drew everyone's attention. Amos Burke's massive frame filled the entrance, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the doorframe. Clara had seen him before. Everyone in Three Pines knew of the reclusive mountain man who lived out by the spring. His presence in town was rare enough to cause a stir, but no one expected what came next. "Miss Weston." His voice was deep and steady, like distant thunder. "You're a virgin and I need sons. Marry me." The words landed like a stone in still water. For a heartbeat, silence gripped the room. Then came the explosion of reactions, gasps from the ladies present, nervous titters from the men, and outright guffaws from others. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but years of handling unruly students had taught her to maintain her composure. She straightened her spine and met his gaze directly. His eyes were the color of well-worn leather and just as weathered. "Mr. Burke," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "Such matters typically require proper courting." More snickers rippled through the crowd. But Clara wasn't finished. She lifted her chin, inspiration striking as she thought of her students. "If you're serious about this proposal, I have a challenge for you." Amos didn't move, didn't blink. He simply waited, still as a mountain. "Build benches," Clara continued, gaining confidence. "Proper benches for every child in my school. Some are sitting on upturned crates, and that's not right." The laughter died away. Everyone knew the school's needs, but no one had stepped forward to help. Clara watched Amos carefully, noting how his expression shifted, just slightly, as he considered her words. "How many?" he asked, his voice gruff but thoughtful. 28 children, Clara replied. "So 28 seats with proper backs for support." Without hesitation, Amos nodded once. "Done." The single word echoed in the suddenly quiet room. He turned to leave, his movements deliberate and sure, but paused at the door. "I'll start tomorrow." The door closed behind him with a solid thunk, leaving the room in stunned silence. Clara could feel every eye on her, could hear the whispers starting already, but she kept her focus on gathering her books, her hands only slightly trembling as she stacked them neatly. Through the window, she watched Amos's tall figure moving down the street, his stride purposeful. The late afternoon sun cast his shadow long across the dusty road. Something stirred in her chest. Not just indignation at his forwardness, but a spark of curiosity about this man who would make such a bold proposal and then accept her challenge without hesitation. Clara found herself touching the small cross at her neck, a habit when she needed guidance. The proposal had been shocking, inappropriate even, But there was something about Amos Burke's direct manner that spoke of honesty, if not social grace. And hadn't she come west precisely to escape the polite pretenses of Boston society? The town council members began their meeting, but their usual discussions of water rights and property lines were punctuated with pointed looks in her direction and poorly concealed smirks. Clara gathered her remaining belongings with dignity, her mind already turning to tomorrow. Would Amos Burke really show up with lumber and tools? And if he did, what would that mean for her challenge, for his proposal? As she stepped out into the baking heat of the late afternoon, Clara spotted a few of her students lingering near the general store. They waved excitedly, and she returned their greeting with a warm smile, even as her thoughts remained fixed on the unexpected events of the day. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, and somewhere out there, a mountain man was presumably planning to build 28 school benches, all because she'd had the courage to answer his startling proposal with a challenge of her own. The first rays of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Clara stirred to the steady rhythm of hammering. At first, she thought it might be woodpeckers in the cottonwoods, but the sound was too measured, too purposeful. Her heart quickened as she remembered yesterday's extraordinary events. Through her boarding house window, she could see a small crowd gathering near the schoolhouse. Clara dressed quickly, choosing her sensible blue cotton dress and pinning her hair neatly. The hammering continued as she made her way down the dusty street. Amos Burke stood in the schoolyard, his massive frame bent over a fresh-cut log. His shoulders moved with careful precision as he split the timber into workable pieces. Sawdust dusted his dark hair, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. A neat pile of lumber lay beside him, each piece measured and marked with careful attention. The townsfolk clustered in small groups, whispering behind raised hands. Clara caught fragments of their gossip as she passed. "Wild man like that, courting our school marm. Living all alone up in them mountains. Never thought I'd see the day." Clara held her head high, though her cheeks burned. She watched as Amos positioned the first bench's seatboard, his movements deliberate and skilled. His large hands, which looked so rough and weathered, worked with surprising gentleness as he fitted the pieces together. The morning sun climbed higher, and Clara noticed the water bucket near the schoolhouse door was empty. She filled it from the pump, and gathering her courage, approached Amos during his brief rest. "Good morning, Mr. Burke," she said, offering him a tin cup of water. "I believe we haven't been properly introduced. I'm Clara Weston." Amos wiped his hands on his trousers before accepting the cup. "Much obliged, Miss Weston." His voice was quiet, meant for her ears alone. He took a careful sip, then gestured to his work. "Pine's good for benches, strong but forgiving under the saw." Clara nodded, noting how the wood gleamed where he'd planed it smooth. "You seem well-versed in carpentry." "A man learns what he needs to." Amos's eyes met hers briefly. "Got a spring up at my place. Sweet water, clean and cold. Homestead's got room for more if there were good hands to run it." The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them. Clara felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. "That's quite a responsibility, managing a homestead." "Reckon it is." He handed back the cup, his calloused fingers careful not to brush against hers. A man shouldn't hold such blessing alone. Before Clara could respond, the sharp click of boots on wooden planks announced Miss Abigail Petticomb's approach. The rival schoolteacher's face was pinched with disapproval as she gestured Clara aside. "A word, Miss Weston, if you please." Clara followed her to the shade of the schoolhouse porch, aware of the townsfolk watching with poorly concealed interest. "This display is most improper," Miss Petticombe hissed, her voice dripping with false concern. "A man of his character, pursuing you so boldly? The school board takes a very dim view of scandal." Clara straightened her spine. "There is no scandal in honest work, Miss Petticombe. Mr. Burke is crafting much-needed benches for our students. At what cost to your reputation? Miss Petticomb's eyes narrowed. Think carefully, Miss Weston. Your teaching position here isn't as secure as you might believe. I appreciate your concern, Clara replied firmly, but I trust the school board will judge me by my work with the children, not by town gossip. Miss Petticomb's mouth tightened, but before she could respond, the sound of hammering resumed. They both turned to watch as Amos carefully assembled the bench's back support. Throughout the day, Clara taught her lessons while Amos worked steadily outside. Her students were distracted by the construction, pressing their faces to the windows whenever they thought she wasn't looking. She found herself stealing glances too, watching as the first bench took shape under his patient hands. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the schoolyard, Amos carried the finished bench into the classroom. He placed it with careful reverence in the front row. Stepping back to study his work, the bench was beautiful in its simplicity. Smooth planed pine, sturdy legs, and a gently curved back for comfort. Clara ran her hand along the polished wood. It's wonderful, Mr. Burke. The children will be so pleased. Amos nodded, his eyes meeting hers in the fading light. First of 28, he said quietly. I'll be back at dawn. He touched the brim of his hat and turned to leave. Clara watched him go, aware of the warmth of the wood beneath her fingers and the weight of the day's events settling around her like dust after a storm. The next few days settled into a rhythm as predictable as a church bell. Each morning, the sound of Amos's work drew curious onlookers to the schoolyard. The pile of finished benches grew steadily, each one crafted with the same careful attention as the first. What surprised Clara most was how the Apache children gravitated toward Amos during their lunch break. They watched him work with silent interest, and soon enough, the bolder ones began helping him sort lumber and hold boards steady. Amos never shooed them away. Instead, he showed them how to check wood grain and measure twice before cutting. Like this, she heard him say softly to young Joseph, demonstrating how to sand with the grain. The boy's face lit up with understanding, and Clara felt something warm settle in her chest. That evening, Clara stayed late in her kitchen, kneading dough with purpose. The next morning, she wrapped still warm bread in a clean cloth and carried it to the schoolyard. Amos accepted it with careful hands, breaking off a piece with a nod of thanks. Ain't had fresh bread since... He paused, something flickering across his face. Been a while. Clara noticed how he shared the bread with the children who helped him, cutting careful portions with his whittling knife. Each slice was distributed with the same precision he gave to measuring lumber. But not everyone viewed these developments with approval. On the fourth day, as Clara was arranging papers on her desk, Reverend Leland Fry appeared in her doorway. His weathered Bible was clutched tight against his chest, his expression troubled. Miss Weston, he began, settling into the chair beside her desk. I must speak plainly about this situation with Mr. Burke. Clara continued organizing her papers, keeping her voice level. Has someone complained about the quality of his benches, Reverend? This isn't about benches, and you know it. Reverend Fry leaned forward, lowering his voice. People are talking. A respectable schoolteacher, entertaining the advances of a mountain man. It's causing concern among the congregation. With all due respect, Reverend, Clara met his gaze steadily, Mr. Burke's actions have been nothing but honorable. He's fulfilling his promise through honest work, and he's shown nothing but kindness to the children. Kindness won't protect your reputation, my dear. The preacher's face softened with genuine concern. Perhaps it would be wise to create some distance. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Clara moved to the window, where she saw a well-dressed stranger posting notices on the schoolhouse bulletin board. His suit was city-cut, and his boots were too clean for frontier travel. Amos had stopped his work, standing perfectly still as he watched the man move from post to post with his papers and tacks. The children who had been helping him drew closer to his side, sensing the sudden tension in the air. Clara stepped out onto the schoolhouse porch, Reverend Fry following close behind. The stranger turned, offering a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Forrester," he introduced himself, tipping his hat. "Representative of the Western Pacific Railroad Company, just posting some official notices regarding unclaimed water rights in the territory." Clara moved closer to read one of the notices, her heart sinking as she took in the legal language. The document declared that all unfiled water sources in the region were subject to railroad acquisition for the expansion of the line. "Mr. Burke's spring is registered with the territory," she said, surprised by the firmness in her voice. Forrester's smile didn't waver. "Our records indicate otherwise, ma'am. Any claims would need proper documentation, filed with the territorial office in person." He glanced at Amos, who stood silent among his half-finished benches. "Quite a journey from the mountains, I imagine. Easy to overlook such formalities when one lives so removed from civilization." Clara felt her face flush with anger at the man's condescending tone. She opened her mouth to respond, but Amos spoke first, his quiet voice carrying across the schoolyard. "My father filed those papers 20 years ago." "Did he now?" Forrester pulled a small notebook from his jacket. "Then I'm sure you won't have any trouble producing copies. You have 30 days to present documentation before the railroad begins its survey." He touched the brim of his hat again. "Good day to you all." As Forrester's footsteps faded down the street, Clara looked at Amos. His face was unreadable, but his hands gripped the lumber he'd been working with until his knuckles went white. The pieces suddenly fell into place. His urgent proposal, his mention of needing help to run the homestead. Without legal proof of his water rights, everything he'd built could be taken away. The Apache children pressed closer to Amos, their young faces serious. He set down his tools and patted Joseph's shoulder gently. "Best head home now," he said softly. "Got work to finish here." Clara watched as the children reluctantly gathered their things. The sound of Amos's hammer resumed, steady and determined, but now she understood it wasn't just benches he was trying to build. It was a future he was fighting to protect. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern hills when Clara secured her picnic basket to her saddle. She'd risen before dawn to prepare a proper meal: cornbread, dried beef, and fresh apple preserves wrapped carefully in clean cloth. Her mare, Belle, stamped impatiently as Clara checked the cinch one final time. The journey to Amos's homestead followed a narrow trail that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and across rocky meadows. Belle picked her way carefully over loose stones, while Clara's thoughts drifted to the man she was riding to meet. What kind of home would a mountain man keep? What secrets lay in the life he'd carved out of this wilderness? After 3 hours of steady climbing, the trail opened onto a small valley. Clara drew Belle to a halt, taking in the sight before her. A sturdy log cabin stood in a natural clearing, its weathered walls speaking of years of careful maintenance. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a neat stack of firewood lined the eastern wall. Behind the cabin, a crystal-clear spring bubbled from the mountainside, its waters catching the morning light. Amos emerged from behind the cabin, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. He seemed different here, more at ease in his own territory. "Didn't expect company," he said, moving to help her dismount. "I thought we might share lunch," Clara replied, lifting the basket. "And I wanted to see where you live." Amos nodded, leading Belle to a post near the water trough. "Spring's running strong today. Come see." He guided Clara along a well-worn path to where the spring emerged from the mountain. The water was so clear she could count the pebbles at the bottom. "Pure as heaven's tears," Amos said quietly. "Feeds half the town's wells by natural flow. Been that way since before my father's time." Clara knelt and dipped her fingers in the cool water. "No wonder the railroad wants it." "Ain't just water," Amos replied, his voice tight. "It's life itself out here." They walked back towards the cabin, and Clara couldn't help but notice how the door hinges gleamed with fresh oil, how the window glass sparkled despite the dusty land. Everything spoke of careful tending, of someone who took pride in maintaining what he had. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. An iron cook stove dominated one wall, while a solid table with 4 chairs stood in the center. But it was the empty spaces that caught Clara's attention. The second rocking chair gathering dust in the corner, the quilt folded precisely on an unused bed, the row of hooks with only one coat hanging. The silence in the cabin seemed to echo with absence. "Sarah loved flowers," Amos said suddenly, running a hand along the windowsill where empty clay pots sat waiting. "Planted them every spring." He fell quiet again, and Clara understood. These weren't just empty spaces. They were places where someone else had once lived and loved. "Shall we eat outside?" Clara suggested gently. "It's such a fine day." Amos led her to a grove of pines near the spring, where a fallen log provided natural seating. Clara spread out their meal while Amos filled 2 tin cups with spring water. The mountain air made everything taste better, the cornbread more satisfying, the preserves sweeter. "Tell me about your dreams for this place," Clara said, watching how Amos's shoulders relaxed as he looked out over his land. "Simple enough," he replied after a long moment. "Want to see it lived in proper. Hear children's voices mixing with the wind. Maybe plant an apple orchard down by the lower meadow." He paused, breaking a piece of cornbread. "Made a promise to Sarah before she passed. Said I'd fill the house with family again. Ain't right for a home to stay empty." Clara studied his profile, seeing past the rough exterior to the gentle heart beneath. This was a man who kept his promises, who believed in building things to last. "Your benches at the school," she said softly. "They're not just furniture, are they? They're your way of showing you can provide, can build something meaningful." Amos met her eyes. "Reckon so." As the afternoon light began to fade, they packed up the remains of their meal. The ride back to town was quieter, both lost in thought. When they reached the edge of 3 pines, Clara turned to Amos. "Perhaps we could do this properly," she suggested. "Real courting, with Sunday walks after church and shared suppers at the boarding house where I stay. Give the town something proper to gossip about, instead of just speculation." Amos's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the closest she'd seen to a smile. "Reckon I'd like that," he said, "though I ain't finished with them benches yet." "No," Clara agreed, something warm settling in her chest. "I suppose you're not." The morning sun cast long shadows across 3 Pines' dusty main street as Amos worked steadily outside the schoolhouse. His large hands moved with surprising grace over the wood, planing each board to silky smoothness. 2 Apache boys, Thomas and Joseph, sat nearby, eagerly learning to sand the bench seats. "Like this?" Thomas asked, demonstrating his technique. Amos nodded, his usual silence softened by the earnest attention of his young helpers. "That's right. Follow the grain." Across the street, Mrs. Whitaker pulled her daughter closer as they passed, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She wasn't the only one. All week, whispers had followed Amos and his young assistants like autumn leaves in the wind. Clara watched from the schoolhouse window, noting how Amos remained unfazed by the sideways glances and muttered comments. He simply continued teaching the boys, showing them how to check for splinters and seal the wood with careful attention. Later that morning, Clara hitched her skirts and climbed the steep stairs to the county clerk's office. The building smelled of dust and old paper, with afternoon light streaming through grimy windows. Mr. Peterson, the clerk, barely looked up from his ledger as she approached. "I need to see the land records for the Burke homestead," Clara said, keeping her voice steady and professional. Peterson shuffled through a stack of documents, finally pulling out a thick folder. "Railroad's already been through these," he said, spreading the papers across his desk. "Filed their claim yesterday morning. Eminent domain. Clara's heart sank as she examined the documents. The railroad's lawyers had found every technical flaw in Amos's claim. His father's verbal agreements with neighbors, the traditional water rights recognized by generations of ranchers, none of it mattered against the power of official stamps and legal terminology. "But the spring serves half the town," Clara protested. "Surely that counts for something?" Peterson just shrugged. "Paper's what matters in court, Miss Weston." Always has. Back in her small room at the boarding house, Clara wrote furiously by lamplight. "Dear James, I pray this letter finds you well. I write seeking your legal counsel regarding a matter of great urgency. A railroad company is attempting to seize a vital water source through eminent domain, exploiting the lack of formal documentation." She detailed everything she knew about Amos's claim, his father's agreements, and the spring's importance to Three Pines. Her brother-in-law was a respected lawyer in Denver. Perhaps he could find a way through this tangle of legal thorns. As the sun set, Clara arranged a simple supper in the schoolhouse. She'd invited Amos to share the meal, away from the prying eyes of the boarding house dining room. He arrived precisely on time, ducking his head slightly to enter through the doorway. The lamplight cast warm shadows across the rough-hewn benches he'd crafted. 6 completed ones now stood in neat rows, each one a testament to his patient labor. Clara had spread a clean cloth over her desk, setting out bread, cheese, and cold chicken. "It ain't much like your fancy Eastern suppers," Amos said, settling carefully onto one of the smaller chairs. Clara smiled, passing him a plate. "I prefer simple meals shared with good company." They ate quietly for a while, the comfortable silence broken only by the distant call of whippoorwills. Finally, Clara spoke about her visit to the clerk's office. Amos nodded slowly, taking in the news about the railroad's claim. "Figured they'd try something like that. Papers never meant much out here. A man's word and his work, that's what counts." "The law doesn't always see it that way," Clara said softly. "I've written to my brother-in-law in Denver. He's a lawyer who might be able to help." Amos studied her face in the lamplight. "Why are you helping me with this?" Clara considered her answer carefully. "Because I believe in what you're building here. Not just these benches, but the way you treat those boys who help you. The way you honor your promises." She paused, gathering her courage. "The way you speak of family and faith not as words on paper, but as things carved in hearts." "Known plenty of men with fine papers and empty hearts," Amos replied. "Seen how they treat the land, their neighbors." He broke off a piece of bread, considering. "Your brother-in-law? He's a good man?" "The best," Clara assured him. "He believes in justice, not just law." Amos nodded, something easing in his expression. "Then I reckon we got hope." He glanced around the schoolhouse, at the benches he'd crafted. "Ain't finished building yet, though." "No," Clara agreed, understanding he meant more than just the benches. "We're not finished building at all." The telegraph office's bell jangled as Clara rushed in, her heart beating fast. Young Tommy, the operator's son, handed her the yellow paper with careful reverence. "CLARA, stop. Claim can be secured with sworn statements from townspeople and formal petition, stop. Need minimum 20 signatures and notarized testimony of water use, stop. Railroad begins. Survey next month, stop. Sending papers express post. James, stop." Clara clutched the telegram, hope and worry warring in her chest. A month wasn't much time to gather what they needed. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Clara smoothed her best dress, a navy wool that had survived the journey west remarkably well. She'd barely stepped into the white-painted church when she heard the collective intake of breath from the congregation. Amos Burke stood in the doorway behind her, clean-shaven and wearing a pressed shirt that strained slightly across his broad shoulders. "Miss Weston," he said quietly, offering his arm. Clara accepted it, holding her head high as they walked down the aisle together. The wooden pews creaked with the shifting of bodies as people turned to stare. Miss Petticomb's fan fluttered rapidly, her face pinched with disapproval. Reverend Leland's sermon focused pointedly on propriety and reputation, his gaze frequently straying to where Clara and Amos sat. Clara kept her eyes forward, though she felt Amos's arm tense beside her with each weighted word. After the final hymn, Clara lingered in the churchyard, speaking with parents about the upcoming school festival. Miss Petticomb's voice carried clearly from nearby. "Shocking display, and to think she teaches our children, consorting with that mountain man barely civilized." "Now, Abigail," Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "Amos Burke's been nothing but respectful." "Respectful?" Miss Petticomb's laugh was sharp. "Proper ladies don't receive marriage proposals in public like some common." "That's enough, Miss Petticomb." Clara turned, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "If you have concerns about my conduct, perhaps we should discuss them directly." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the tension. Miss Petticomb's eyes glittered with triumph as she raised her voice. "Indeed! I move for an immediate town council meeting. The moral character of our schoolteacher affects every family in Three Pines." Within an hour, the town hall filled with curious onlookers. The council members sat at their long table, looking uncomfortable as Miss Petticomb held forth. "Sets an impossible example for our young ladies, entertaining improper advances, allowing that man to loiter around the schoolhouse." "Mr. Burke is building benches for our children," Clara interjected. "At my request, as a condition of his courtship." "Courtship?" Miss Petticomb's voice dripped with disdain. "Is that what we're calling such irregular behavior?" Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Miss Weston, while we appreciate your dedication to the school, perhaps it would be best if you took some time to consider your position, at least until this situation resolves itself." "You mean until I send away the only man willing to stand against the railroad's theft?" Clara's words caused a stir. She hadn't meant to reveal that yet, but anger loosened her tongue. The door banged open. Amos filled the frame, his expression thunderous. He'd clearly heard everything. "You folks sitting in judgment?" His quiet voice carried to every corner. "Reckon I'm the cause of this trouble. Miss Weston's done nothing but bring education and kindness to this town. If my courting her causes shame, I'll fix it proper." He strode forward, stopping before the council table. "I'm asking her to marry me, right now, today." The room erupted in whispers. Clara's heart pounded as Amos turned to her, his eyes softening. "That is," he added more quietly, "if she'll have me." Clara stepped forward, chin lifted. "I will." She turned to face the council. "But not in shame or haste. We'll be married in the church, before God and this community, with a proper sermon on mercy and judgment." She met Miss Petticomb's startled gaze. "Since everyone seems so concerned with proper examples, let's set one worth following." Reverend Leland stood from his council seat. "The church is available this afternoon." "No," Clara said firmly. "Next Sunday. Time enough for banns to be read and for everyone to examine their own hearts about mercy and community." She looked up at Amos. "And time enough to finish those benches properly." Amos's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Yes, ma'am." The council chamber slowly emptied, leaving Clara and Amos standing before the table. Mayor Thompson shook his head, looking both exasperated and amused. "Well, I suppose that settles the matter of Miss Weston's position at the school," he said, "though we'll need to discuss your housing arrangements after the wedding." "She'll be moving to my place," Amos said, "once we've gathered those affidavits about the spring." The mayor's eyebrows rose. "Affidavits?" Clara pulled out her brother's telegram. "Yes, Mr. Mayor, and we'll need your help with those." The week before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation and whispered controversy. Reverend Leland paced his study for nearly an hour before agreeing to perform the ceremony. His weathered face creased with concern. "It ain't proper, this rush to the altar," he muttered, though his eyes softened when Clara explained about the railroad's deadline. "Sometimes, Reverend," Clara said quietly, "the Lord's timing doesn't match our ideas of proper—" The church ladies' auxiliary, led by Miss Petticombe, declined to help with preparations. Their absence hung heavy in the empty church as Clara stood alone, wondering how to make the bare wooden walls feel festive. But she wasn't alone for long. That afternoon, Maria, one of her Apache students, arrived with her grandmother. The elderly woman's arms overflowed with desert wildflowers, purple lupine, golden poppies, and delicate white yarrow. More children followed, bringing flowers and woven grass decorations. "For you, Miss Weston," Maria said, presenting a crown of tiny white blossoms. "Grandmother says every bride needs flowers in her hair." The widow Henderson appeared with fresh-baked bread and preserves. The Cooper family, who lived on the outskirts of town, brought chairs and helped arrange them. Even Tommy from the telegraph office snuck in with armfuls of ribbon he'd found in his mother's sewing chest. In his workshop behind the schoolhouse, Amos labored over a special wedding gift. The bench he carved was smaller than the school benches, sized perfectly for two. Clara caught glimpses of him working late into the evening, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he carved words into the wood. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Clara dressed in her best white cotton dress, simple but freshly pressed. She'd added a bit of lace at the collar, saved from her mother's wedding dress. Her hands trembled slightly as Maria's grandmother helped her pin the wildflower crown in place. "You look like spring itself," Widow Henderson declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The church bell rang out at 10 o'clock, its clear tones carrying across the quiet town. Clara walked from the schoolhouse to the church, accompanied by her students. The children had formed an honor guard of sorts, the girls sprinkling flower petals while the boys carried the last of Amos's newly finished school benches, his promise fulfilled. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dew still fresh on the wildflowers. Only a quarter of the pews held people, but those who came sat proud and straight-backed. The Cooper family, the Hendersons, several Apache families, and a scattering of miners and farmhands who'd known Amos's kindness over the years. Amos stood at the altar, his massive frame wrapped in clean homespun. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, though a few stubborn strands still curled around his ears. His eyes never left Clara as she walked down the aisle, his expression one of quiet wonder. Before them sat the wedding bench, its surface gleaming with fresh oil. Clara's breath caught as she read the words carved along its length. "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Reverend Leland cleared his throat, his initial reluctance giving way to genuine warmth as he began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The vows were simple, spoken in clear, steady voices that filled the small church. Amos's hands engulfed Clara's as they exchanged rings. His, a plain gold band she'd ordered from Denver. Hers, a delicate silver ring that had belonged to his mother. "I, Amos Burke, take thee, Clara Weston. I, Clara Weston, take thee, Amos Burke." When Reverend Leland pronounced them man and wife, the small congregation erupted in genuine cheers. Maria tossed her entire basket of flower petals over them, and the other children quickly followed suit, filling the air with floating petals and laughter. They celebrated under the schoolyard's cottonwoods, their branches casting dappled shade over the simple feast spread across pushed-together benches. Widow Henderson's bread and preserves, Mrs. Cooper's fried chicken, and dishes brought by the Apache families, sweet corn cakes and spiced rabbit stew, created a wedding feast that spoke of two cultures coming together. Amos and Clara sat on their wedding bench, now positioned at the head of the makeshift table. He cut thick slices of bread for the children while she poured lemonade. Their movements already showed signs of comfortable familiarity, each anticipating the other's needs. "Never seen Amos smile so much," old Jim Cooper observed to his wife, watching as the mountain man helped little Maria reach the honey pot. The afternoon sun turned golden, filtering through the cottonwood leaves as the small gathering shared food, stories, and hope. It wasn't the grand wedding some might have expected for the town's schoolteacher, but in its simplicity and sincerity, it held something far more precious: the birth of a family that defied boundaries and reached across divides. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Clara and Amos mounted their horses. The wedding flowers still hung in the church, their petals beginning to curl in the warmth. Clara adjusted her riding skirt, watching as Amos secured their saddlebags and documents for the journey to the county seat. "Reckon we should make Copper Creek by nightfall," Amos said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty she'd come to recognize. "Good place to camp, if you don't mind sleeping under the stars." Clara nodded, remembering her first sight of his mountain homestead. "I've grown fond of stars lately." The town slowly fell behind them as their horses picked their way along the dusty trail. Clara found herself studying her new husband's broad back, the way he unconsciously shifted to match his horse's movements. The silver ring on her finger caught the morning light, still unfamiliar but somehow right. They rode steadily through the morning, stopping briefly at noon to rest the horses and share a simple meal of bread and dried beef. Clara noticed how Amos always scanned the horizon before settling, how he positioned himself to keep both her and the horses in view. As the afternoon sun began its westward slide, the landscape changed. Scrub gave way to scattered pines, and the air grew cooler with elevation. Amos led them off the main trail, following what seemed like invisible markers, until they reached a small creek lined with copper-colored stones. "This here's Copper Creek," Amos said, dismounting. "Good water, good shelter." He helped Clara down, his hands strong but gentle on her waist. "Used to trap in these parts before—" He fell silent, and Clara recognized the shadow that crossed his face. She'd seen it before when he spoke of his home, of the empty rooms that needed filling. They worked together setting up camp, falling into an easy rhythm. Amos gathered wood while Clara laid out their bedrolls near a natural hollow in the creek bank. Soon, a small fire crackled, casting dancing shadows as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Over a dinner of beans and coffee, Clara watched the firelight play across Amos's features. His usual stoic expression had softened in the gathering dark. "Tell me about her," Clara said softly. "Your first wife?" Amos was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Sarah. Her name was Sarah." He stirred the fire with a stick. "Met her when I was still running trap lines. She could shoot straighter than most men, and had a way with herbs that saved more than one settler's life." His eyes grew distant. "Lost her and the baby both 3 years ago. Fever took them before the doctor could make it up the mountain." Clara reached across the space between them, laying her hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Amos." He covered her hand with his own. "Been mighty lonely up there since. House needs a woman's touch, needs children's laughter." He looked at her directly. "That's why I came to town that day. Saw how you were with them children, settler and Apache alike. Saw something worth building on." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward toward the emerging stars. Clara drew a deep breath, knowing it was her turn to share. "I was engaged back east," she said, watching the flames. "To a minister twice my age. My father arranged it, thought it would secure my future and help his missionary work." She felt Amos's steady gaze. "The minister wanted a proper wife who'd stay home, tend his house, bear his children. But I'd seen too much working in my father's mission school, knew I could do more." "So you ran," Amos said simply. Clara nodded. "Took a teaching position out west. My father hasn't written since. They sat in comfortable silence, the creek's gentle murmur mixing with the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. Clara found herself leaning against Amos's solid warmth. "Reckon we both know something about choosing our own path," he said finally. "Yes," Clara agreed, "though I never expected my path to lead to a mountain man proposing in my schoolhouse." Amos's chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "Never expected to be building school benches to win a wife." They spread their bedrolls side by side, close enough to share warmth. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, countless points of light in the velvet darkness. Clara felt Amos's arm slip around her waist, drawing her close. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" "For seeing past what others see, for choosing this path with me." Clara turned in his embrace, finding his face in the starlight. "We'll save your spring, Amos. Tomorrow we'll file the claim, and then we'll build something new. Together." His kiss was gentle, tasting of coffee and promise. They fell asleep under the vast sky, no longer two souls seeking shelter, but one family forging their own way forward. The county clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. Clara watched as Amos carefully signed his name to the land claim documents, his large hands steady despite the importance of the moment. The clerk stamped each page with practiced efficiency, the thump of official seals echoing in the quiet room. "That should do it," the clerk said, shuffling the papers into order. "Everything's properly filed now." They rode back to Three Pines with the precious documents secured in Amos's saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The spring sunshine felt warmer somehow, as if nature itself approved of their efforts. Clara noticed how Amos sat straighter in his saddle, pride and relief evident in the set of his shoulders. Back in town, a letter waited at the post office. Clara recognized her brother-in-law's precise handwriting immediately. Inside, they found additional legal documents supporting their claim, complete with sworn statements and official seals. "These'll help," Amos said, reading through the papers slowly. "Your kin's done right by us." The following days settled into a gentle rhythm. Each morning Clara would ring the school bell, and children would file in, settler and Apache alike. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see Amos in the yard, showing the older boys how to whittle and shape wood. During their lunch break, he'd gather them around, demonstrating how to set snares or identify animal tracks in the dust. "Mr. Burke," young Tommy Watson called out one afternoon, "how come you can tell rabbit tracks from deer tracks so easy?" Amos knelt beside the boy, his large frame somehow less intimidating as he traced shapes in the dirt. "See here? Rabbit leaves 4 marks, tight together. Deer's got these 2 points, like this." Clara watched from the schoolhouse steps, her heart full at the sight of her husband's patient instruction. The children hung on his every word, their faces eager and attentive. Even the most reluctant students had begun staying after lessons to learn from the mountain man who'd become their unexpected teacher. In the evenings, they'd ride together to check on the spring. The water flowed clear and strong, cascading down the mountainside just as it had for generations. Clara loved these quiet moments, watching Amos test the flow and clear any debris from the natural channels that fed the town's water supply. "Water's running good," he'd say, satisfaction in his voice. "Should serve the town proper through summer." But their peace wasn't complete. Clara noticed the railroad men first, 3 of them, standing at the edge of town with surveying equipment and maps. They appeared each morning, making measurements and taking notes, their presence a constant reminder of the threat to Amos's spring. "They're waiting for something," Clara said one evening, as she and Amos sat on their cabin's porch. "I can feel it." Amos nodded, his eyes on the distant figures. "Reckon they are, but we've got the law on our side now. Papers all filed proper." Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The children love learning from you, you know. Even Miss Petticombe had to admit your carpentry lessons have improved their arithmetic." A small smile crossed Amos's face. "Never thought I'd be teaching anything to anyone. Just doing what needs doing." The railroad men's presence cast a shadow over their days, but life continued. Clara taught her lessons, now using examples from Amos's work to illustrate mathematics and natural science. The new benches filled the schoolhouse, each one crafted with care and attention to detail. One afternoon, Clara discovered several of her Apache students teaching Amos their words for different types of wood. He listened intently, repeating the unfamiliar sounds until he got them right. The children beamed with pride at being the teachers for once. "You're building bridges," Clara told him later as they walked home together, "not just benches." "Ain't nothing special about it," Amos replied, but his eyes were warm. "Just treating folks like folks." The filed documents lay secure in their cabin, a shield of legal protection against the railroad's ambitions. Clara found herself touching them each morning, drawing reassurance from their official stamps and seals. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that their current peace was fragile, like the calm before a storm. Still, she chose to focus on the present moments, the sound of children's laughter mixing with Amos's deep voice in the schoolyard, the satisfaction of seeing young minds grow and learn, the quiet evenings when she and Amos would sit together, planning improvements for both the school and their home. "We'll weather whatever comes," Amos said one night, as if reading her thoughts. "Got something worth protecting here." Clara nodded, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The railroad men had packed up their equipment for the day, but she knew they'd be back tomorrow, hovering at the edges of their hard-won happiness like circling hawks. Clara jerked awake in the dark, her heart pounding. Something had pulled her from sleep, a scent that didn't belong in the night air. Smoke, not the familiar comfort of wood stove smoke, but something more sinister. "Amos," she whispered, shaking his shoulder, "wake up." He was instantly alert, nostrils flaring as he caught the same scent. They rushed to the window. In the distance, an orange glow lit the night sky like a false dawn. "The homestead," Amos breathed, already pulling on his boots. They saddled their horses in record time, the animals sensing their urgency. The ride seemed endless, though they pushed their mounts as fast as they dared in the dark. As they crested the final ridge, Clara's breath caught in her throat. The cabin was fully engulfed in flames. Fire reached toward the stars with hungry fingers, consuming the log walls Amos had built with his own hands. 3 figures on horseback disappeared into the darkness, but their identity was clear. The railroad men had struck their blow. Amos spurred his horse forward, but it was already too late. The heat pushed them back, forcing them to watch helplessly as the flames devoured everything. The roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "Sarah's things," Amos choked out, his voice raw. "All her things." Clara understood immediately. Beyond the timber and tools, beyond the furniture and supplies, the fire was consuming irreplaceable treasures. His late wife's quilts, her letters, the small touches that had made the cabin a home. Memories turned to ash in the merciless blaze. The spring burbled nearby, untouched by the destruction. Its constant flow seemed to mock their loss, a reminder of what the railroad truly wanted. They couldn't burn water. Clara wrapped her arms around Amos's waist, pressing her cheek against his back. His body shook with silent grief. They stood together until the flames died down to glowing embers, until the false dawn faded and the true one began to paint the sky. "We should head back to town," Clara suggested gently, as morning light revealed the full extent of the destruction. Amos shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "Number, we stay right here." He began gathering scattered tools that had survived the fire, salvaging what he could from the ashes. Clara understood. Leaving now would mean letting the railroad win, surrendering the spring they'd fought so hard to protect. "Then we'll need supplies," she said. "I'll ride back and gather what we need." Amos nodded, already clearing a space to make camp. "Ain't leaving this spring unguarded again." Clara rode into Three Pines as the town was waking. News of the fire spread quickly, and to her surprise, faces showed more outrage than satisfaction. Even Miss Petticombe looked troubled by such lawless destruction. When Clara arrived at the schoolhouse, her students were already gathering, faces worried. She rang the bell, calling them together. "Mr. Burke's homestead was burned last night," she announced, watching their expressions shift from concern to anger. "We're going to help rebuild it." Tommy Watson's hand shot up. "My pa's got spare timber. He said what they did ain't right." Sarah Yellowhawk, one of her Apache students, spoke next. "My uncle will help build. He knows the old ways of raising walls." More offers came: tools, food, labor. Clara's heart swelled with pride as her students, both settler and Apache, came together with purpose. She organized them quickly, sending messages home with each child. By mid-morning, a wagon train of supplies was heading toward the spring. Clara led the way, hope rising with each hoofbeat. They found Amos still standing guard, his broad shoulders straight despite his exhaustion. The children swarmed around him, their young voices full of determination and encouragement. Clara watched as his stance softened, saw the flicker of life return to his eyes as tiny hands offered him water, bread, and promises of help. "We'll build it better," Tommy declared, already sorting through his father's donated timber. "Stronger," Sarah added, showing Amos the traditional building techniques her uncle had described. Throughout the day, more townspeople arrived. The sheriff himself rode up to take statements about the arson, his face grim with official purpose. Clara's brother-in-law's documents were safe in town, their legal shield still intact despite the attack. As evening approached, a temporary shelter stood near the spring. It wasn't much, just canvas and poles, but it declared their presence on the land. Clara and Amos sat together near their campfire, surrounded by the remnants of their community's support. "Didn't expect this," Amos said quietly, watching the flames, so different from the destructive blaze of the night before. Clara squeezed his hand. "They burned down walls, but they built up something stronger. Look what they brought together instead." The spring continued its eternal flow behind them, witness to destruction and renewal. Under the stars, they held each other, their resolve hardened rather than broken by the trial they faced. Dawn broke over the mountain spring with new purpose. Where destruction had reigned just days before, hope now stirred in the crisp morning air. The sound of hammers and saws echoed across the clearing, mixing with the gentle burble of the spring. 3 Apache families arrived first, led by Sarah Yellowhawk's uncle, Joseph. They carried bundles of tools and knowledge passed down through generations. Joseph studied the burned ground, then pointed to a spot where the earth sloped gently. "Here," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "We build bigger. Strong foundation." Amos nodded, respecting the wisdom in Joseph's words. The new building would serve more than just their family. It would be a place of learning and worship, where all could gather without fear of judgment. Clara organized the work with the efficiency of a seasoned teacher. She divided the volunteers into teams, setting up a rotation for hauling water, cutting timber, and preparing meals. Her slate board, salvaged from the schoolhouse, now displayed building plans instead of arithmetic. "Mind those measurements," she called out to Tommy Watson, who was helping his father saw planks. "We need room for 30 students at least." Throughout the morning, more wagons arrived from town. They came slowly at first, almost hesitantly, as if testing the waters. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, brought fresh bread and refused to meet anyone's eye as she hurried away. But she returned the next day with more supplies and stayed to help serve lunch. Old Mr. Harrison, who had once complained loudly about mixing in Clara's classroom, drove up with a wagon full of prime timber. "Found these extra boards in my barn," he muttered, though everyone knew he had just purchased them from the lumber mill. "Shame to let them go to waste." The women of Three Pines began arriving with baskets and determination. They set up a cooking station near the spring, where cast-iron pots bubbled with hearty stews. The aroma drew workers from their tasks, and during meal times, the boundaries between settler and Apache blurred over shared bread and conversation. Each evening, as the sun painted the mountain gold, Clara and Amos would survey the day's progress. The new foundation took shape, broader and more ambitious than the original cabin. Joseph's design incorporated both Western building techniques and traditional Apache wisdom about working with the land. "Never thought I'd see the day," Amos said quietly, watching Apache children teaching settler boys how to strip bark from logs the traditional way. "Reckon sometimes it takes losing everything to gain something better." Clara squeezed his hand, understanding the depth of what he meant. The loss of Sarah's keepsakes still weighed heavy, but new memories were being forged in the ashes of the old. The building rose steadily, day by day. Walls of sturdy timber reached toward the sky, while a stone foundation anchored them firmly to the earth. Windows, more than the original cabin had boasted, were carefully placed to catch both morning and afternoon light. The railroad men kept their distance, perhaps sensing the shift in the town's loyalty. The sheriff made regular patrols, his presence a reminder that law and order stood with those who chose to build rather than destroy. 1 week into the construction, Reverend Leland himself arrived. He stood awkwardly at first, his proper collar wilting in the mountain air. But soon enough, he had rolled up his sleeves and joined the work crew, quoting scripture about building on solid foundations as he helped lay floor joists. "Reckon we could use this as a proper chapel come Sundays," he said during a water break, wiping sweat from his brow. "If you're amenable, that is." Amos looked at Clara, who nodded. "Reckon that would be fitting," he replied, "long as everyone's welcome to worship." The Reverend glanced at the Apache families working alongside his parishioners, then squared his shoulders. "As the good book says, God's house is open to all his children." Each night, Clara and Amos camped by the spring, their canvas shelter a temporary home while the permanent one took shape. Often they were joined by others who stayed to guard the site, sharing stories and songs around the campfire. Apache elders taught settler children their stories of the stars, while pioneer women exchanged recipes with native mothers. The work was hard, the days long and filled with aching muscles. Yet there was joy in the shared purpose, in the way calloused hands passed tools back and forth without regard for the color of skin or the accent of speech. Where the railroad had sought to divide and conquer, their violence had instead planted seeds of unity that grew stronger with each nail driven, each stone laid, each meal shared. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as wagons rolled up the mountain path to the newly completed homestead. Dust clouds marked their progress against the golden aspen trees. The structure stood proud against the backdrop of Amos's cherished spring, its fresh-cut timber gleaming in the morning light. Clara Burke stood on the wide front porch, one hand resting on her growing belly, the other shading her eyes as she watched the townspeople arrive. The sight brought tears to her eyes, not just the weary ones who'd helped rebuild, but faces she hadn't expected to see. Even Miss Petticomb's wagon creaked up the path. "Reckon they're all here now," Amos said softly, appearing beside her. His large hand covered hers where it rested on her middle. "You feeling strong enough for this?" Clara squeezed his fingers. "Strong as the spring itself," she assured him. The morning sickness had finally passed, leaving her with a glow that matched the autumn colors. The homestead they'd built was larger than Amos's original cabin, with high windows that caught the mountain light. Wide benches, crafted by Amos's patient hands, lined the main room in neat rows. A simple pulpit stood at the front, carved with the same care as the wedding bench that now sat in their private quarters. People filed in, settling onto the benches, settlers and Apache families alike. The mixed gathering would have been unthinkable just months ago. Children darted between the rows, their laughter echoing off the fresh pine walls. Clara's heart swelled at the sight of her students, clean-faced and excited for this new chapter. Reverend Leland stood to begin the dedication service, his earlier disapproval replaced by humble acceptance. "We gather today to dedicate Burke's Bench," he announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. "A place of learning, worship, and refuge for all God's children." Amos shifted uncomfortably at being the center of attention, but stood tall beside Clara. The name Burke's Bench had been the town's idea, a reminder of how this all began with one man's determination to build seats for every child. When it was Clara's turn to speak, she moved to the pulpit with grace, her condition visible beneath her best dress. The sight of her, clearly carrying new life, seemed to soften even the hardest faces in the crowd. "We build houses in 2 ways, she began, her teacher's voice steady and clear. "With our hands and with our hearts. These walls rose from ashes because hands of all colors lifted the beams. These benches stand sturdy because hearts of all backgrounds chose to work together." Tears glistened in many eyes as she continued. "My husband began this journey by crafting simple benches, believing every child deserves a place to sit and learn. Now we have built something greater, a sanctuary where all are welcome, where water flows freely, and where mercy triumphs over judgment." Old Mrs. Whitaker, who had once whispered against Clara's marriage, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Several Apache mothers nodded in approval, their faces bright with pride. "This spring," Clara gestured toward the window where the water sparkled, "has always belonged to the mountains. Like God's grace, it was never meant to be hoarded or sold. Through this place, it will continue to nourish our children and our children's children." Amos stepped forward then, speaking more words at once than many had ever heard from him. "My first wife made me promise to fill this house with family," he said, his deep voice rough with emotion. "Reckon she'd be pleased to see it so full today." The simple honesty of his words brought fresh tears to many eyes. Clara reached for his hand, and they stood together as Reverend Leland led the congregation in a hymn. The sound of many voices raised together rolled down the mountainside like the spring itself. After the service, tables were set up outside for a celebration feast. Women who had once turned their backs on Clara now pressed plates of cornbread and preserved fruits into her hands. Children played tag around the spring, their laughter mixing with the water's song. Even the town council members who had once threatened Clara's position now spoke of Burke's Bench with pride, as if they'd supported it all along. As the afternoon sun gilded the autumn leaves, Clara found Amos standing quiet by his beloved spring. She joined him, feeling the life within her stir, as if in recognition of this place that would be its heritage. "You did it," she said softly. "You built those benches and won their hearts." Amos shook his head, drawing her close. "We did it," he corrected. "You saw past the mountain man to the promise underneath. Reckon that's what teaching's really about." They stood together, watching their unlikely family, Apache and settler, young and old, former foes and faithful friends, share food and fellowship in the yard of Burke's Bench, their sanctuary built by hands and hearts alike. Snow blanketed the mountain paths around Burke's Bench that December morning. Inside the warm homestead, Clara's labor pains had started just before dawn. Word spread quickly through Three Pines, and soon the main hall filled with anxious well-wishers. Sarah Littledove, an Apache midwife who had become one of Clara's dearest friends, took charge of the birthing room. Her calm presence steadied everyone's nerves as Clara's cries echoed through the wooden walls. Amos paced outside like a caged bear, his huge hands clenching and unclenching with each sound from his wife. The children who had arrived for their usual lessons sat quietly on their benches, whispering prayers they'd learned from both settler parents and tribal elders. Even Miss Petticombe had come, bringing a bundle of clean linens and a softer expression than anyone had ever seen on her face. When the baby's first cry pierced the winter quiet, Amos stopped mid-stride. Sarah emerged, her face glowing. "A strong boy," she announced, "healthy as the spring itself." Amos entered the room with trembling steps. Clara lay propped against pillows, her face tired but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a quilt made by the townswomen. "Come meet your son," she whispered. The mountain man who could break wild horses and fell trees with ease now moved as carefully as if handling spun glass. He gathered his son in his arms, marvel plain on his weathered face. The baby's eyes, already alert, seemed to study him with Clara's same thoughtful gaze. "Welcome home, little one," Amos murmured, his voice rough with joy. As evening settled in, the well-wishers departed, leaving the new family in peace. Lamplight cast warm shadows across the wooden walls as Clara nursed their son in the rocking chair Amos had carved for her months before. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Clara asked, a teasing light in her eyes. "Right there in front of everyone?" Amos ducked his head, chuckling low. "You're a virgin and I need sons," he quoted himself. "Reckon I could have been more gentle about it." "Reckon you could have," Clara agreed, laughing softly. "But here we are all the same." From the main hall came the sound of children's voices, the evening students who stayed late for extra lessons. The happy noise filtered through their home like music, a chorus of young lives touched by their unlikely union. Amos led Clara and the baby to the doorway, where they watched him guide small hands in carving names into a fresh-made bench. "Everyone leaves their mark," he explained to the children, demonstrating with his knife. "So's future generations know who came before." The lamplight caught the fresh-carved letters, each one a promise for tomorrow, while their newborn son slept peacefully in Clara's arms, the newest mark in their ever-growing family story. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.